Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Wendy. It is such a joy to see so many familiar faces, so many new faces here at Wendi Norris Gallery to celebrate our dearest Chitra Ganesh. We are celebrating so many things today. The first being her new exhibition, Tiger in the Looking Glass, which is right in front of us, and it's gorgeous. We're also celebrating the release of her very first monograph, published by Distance, and there is so many amazing things that are going on right now. Chitra just had a commission at Penn Station, so for those of us who are listening from the East Coast or who traveled through the East Coast, she has turned that very dreary station into something quite magical and, dare I say, really shifted our perception of what it means to actually look at public space in this way. And this is something that I love about Chitra, is that she's really an artist who takes us in a way to rethink about what is ordinary, what is extraordinary. And it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with her. So I'll introduce myself. I'll let Janna introduce herself. Chitra needs no introduction. But my name is Tausif Noor. I am curatorial associate at the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive. I'm a critic, curator, and I contributed an essay to the monograph. And more importantly, I am a dear friend of Chitra, and we've known each other for over a decade. I like to tell this story. It's a little embarrassing for me, but I was an undergrad in an art history class on contemporary Asian art, and I wrote an essay on Chitra's work in relation to Julia Kristeva's theory of abjection. It's like when you first encounter theory, you think it's a diamond cutter instead of a baseball bat, which it really is. But I wrote that essay and it was published, and I was living in India a year after graduating, wandering around the India Art Fair, where Chitra was working on a beautiful mural with Dhruvi Acharya at the Gallery Espace booth. And me being 23 and bold, walked up to her and was like, "Hi, my name is Tausif. I wrote an essay. I love your work. I wrote an essay about your work." And she just hugged me and embraced me and was like, "I actually read it. It was wonderful." And that kind of encouragement at that age, well, it's just stayed with me my entire life. And I feel like I would not have the confidence to do what I do without your support over the years. So it's really special to have you and be in conversation with you. And I'll turn it over to Janna to introduce herself.
Gosh, I wish I had a story that's.
I set you up.
I like to think I have new friends.
Yeah.
But I'm Janna Keegan. I'm the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art over at the De Young and the Legion of Honor, together with the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco.
Yes.
I'm very excited to chat about her work.
Yes.
Really happy for both of you to be here. And for all of you on Saturday afternoon. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. We're gonna just jump right in. I want to talk a little bit first about the catalog, the monograph published by Distance that's available back there if you people in the room want to pick up a copy later. But I want to say something about the assembling of this text because it's such a unique way of putting together a group of people who have really been thinking about your work for a long time. So I'll just give a brief sort of summary of the structure of the book. There's a wonderful introduction by the curator Jasmine Wahi called Galactic Art Didi that talks about Chitra as such a close companion and friend and supporter of the arts and support of other people. There's an essay by Saisha Grayson, who curated Chitra's first solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum that discusses Chitra's series Tales of Amnesia, threading and discussing how Chitra threads together feminist, post-colonial, and queer theory so seamlessly in her work. Natasha Bisnoff talks about the surrealism of Chitra's of and how she expands the surrealist canon. Swati Shah has written a wonderful essay about the myth of time, about portals, palimpsest, and chimeras, and how those critique reality in Chitra's work. Gayatri Gopinath talks about the utopianism of Chitra's series, Sultana's Dream, thinking about collectivity and collaboration. And Ksenia Soboleva does a wonderful analysis of Chitra's installation at the facade of the Leslie Lohman Museum. There's a dialogue between Chitra and Erica Cardwell, where she really gets into, how she came to be such a remarkably eclectic and wonderful artist. And it's just, again, I want to maybe ask you a little bit about how assembling this group of people, these group of queer feminist people, I think speaks to the ethos of your work. It's not a traditional monograph in the way that it's just, Natasha is a wonderful art historian, but it's not just art historians. It's people coming from different aspects. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that kind of assembling as a queer feminist gesture.
Absolutely. So I think, so the monograph was, its inception came about after I had a survey show at the Contemporary Calgary, which is a museum in Canada. And due to, it was originally going to be a traveling catalog, but due to the pandemic and many other things that happened, we decided to make it a monograph instead. And I guess I think a lot in terms of the collective and how there are these conversations that happen across discipline, across generation, across different formal strategies, ways in which certain movements, such as surrealism, have really opened up a place for younger artists in multiple generations after me as well. And that's been something really important about showing my work here at Gallery Wendi Norris, because Wendi has been at the forefront of that. So thinking about how all of these discourses come together. And so for myself, like many artists or thinkers or dancers or musicians, I create the kind of work that I wish were already in the world, but is not here yet. So I create images that I want to see. And when I was growing up as the child of immigrants in 1980s New York, there were very few of those kinds of images and imaginings. And so coming into the art world in the late 90s at a time when it's really differently, its demographics and layout are very different at that time, were very different at that time than they are now. A lot of us talked about how in order to really stake our ground and connect with audiences and connect with other viewers and makers, discourse was a really important part of that. And part of not seeing yourself in the world or not feeling necessarily seen in a mainstream context is writing your own discourse or writing yourself into a matrix of discourses. So that's part of what was interesting about this book, to have conversations with people who are art historians, but also queer historians, ethnographers and anthropologists, cultural studies folks, and also people who work in between fiction, memoir, and curation. So for me, it was really, and I also believe in the importance and the politics of citation. So to amplify the voices that are connected to and in very thoughtful conversation with my own work.
I mean, this is what I'm talking about. There's so much richness in how Chitra thinks and how she, thinks about her own practice, but also thinks about the ethics of how to be an artist. So I'm just going to pull out one of these threads right now, and we'll go back to a lot of things you mentioned. But you mentioned creating the world that you want to see, that kind of utopian sort of vision. And Janna, I'm hoping that maybe I can bring you into this discussion about utopianism and maybe a little bit about world building in Chitra's works that, even that we're seeing around us right here, this new series of works, we see so much of a kind of imagining that, pays homage to certain surrealist strands. You see a little bit of Henri Rousseau in this titular work, Tiger in the Looking Glass, but there's also so much that extends beyond citation, beyond historicism, into a sort of amazing science fiction utopian vision. And I know that this is something that you think a lot about in your own curatorial practice as well.
Yeah, it is absolutely. I think Uncanny Valley is where we worked with Zach Blass and a lot of artists who were using sci-fi as a place to explore queer themes, as just a natural home to queerness, if you will. If you think of Donna Haraway's Cyborg
Of
Manifesto,
course, yeah.
obviously, I actually am wondering, because you do have this figure of the chimera, which comes in your work a lot. Could you talk about the choice of chimera versus like a cyborg, and why you use the chimera as this very like fluid and flexible figure to sort of disrupt traditional notions of identity?
Yeah, so for me, the chimera, for example, in relation to the cyborg, is also a way of thinking about the relationship between science fiction and mythology, and how there's a really rich overlap there, because they both ask you questions about, how we got here, what humanity is, what justice is, what a human is, what a subhuman is. How we are supposed to be as citizens, how an ideal world should be versus the world we live in. So, thinking about, I think in my earlier explorations, I was thinking more prominently through the frame of mythology and epic myth, and whether that was mythic stories like the Iliad or the Odyssey, but also thinking about the way in which I love science fiction, and just myself engaging with it and watching it and learning more about myth. I was thinking like, hey, um, the kind of temporality, the nonlinear temporality that you see in myth, in, for example, Homer's Odyssey, where we start in the middle of the story, is not that different from how we start in the middle of the story in Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica. So for me, that was one of the ways. And I feel like the chimera, just to get back to your question, feels feels a little bit more open-ended and polymorphous than the way that I was thinking about the cyborg. And so there's also that is layered in there, but there's also other layering of animal, spirit, and then like multiple subjectivities.
Right. And that multiplicity, I would love to talk about how, it operates so beautifully and fluidly formally across Chitra's work. So, across the works that we're seeing here, I'm just going to read, just one of the list of materials in the piece right behind us. So, Enter the Jungle. Watercolor, acrylic, gouache, ink, glass, and acrylic paper on paper mounted on linen. And then right here, this is called resting place. Watercolor, gouache, vintage jewelry, clay, and embroidery on paper mounted on linen. So the very structuring of your works, and the very sort of multiplicity of materials that you use and techniques. You use embroidery, you're bringing in not just embroidery, but also specific kinds of stitching that are native to certain parts of the South Asian subcontinent. You're bringing in beads and glass. In other installations that you've done, murals, you've brought in hair, acrylic, different kinds of materials that 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 gesture in itself, that formal sort of panoply of objects speaks to that kind of limitlessness that I think your works offer. It's not just about let me illustrate one particular thing, but let me offer everyone different ways of entering the work by recognizing, certain forms of decoration that might be familiar, certain forms of mark making, but then also just literally different materials. So you get this multi-sensory experience when you look at any of Chitra's work. And I think that kind of opening up of the visual experience to something a little bit more tactile and sensuous, that's also so ingrained in your practice.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that out and recognizing that. I definitely think about offering multiple points of entry into the work. And so there's a lot of layers in the works where I'm incorporating certain motifs or patterns that are meaningful to me on a personal level that may not necessarily, that exact meaning may not translate out to an audience, but there is something about encountering certain materials that have a sensibility that are outside of and beyond fine art and contemporary art that also provides a point of entry into the work. As you were talking, I was just thinking about how until I was about 4 years old, my mother sewed all of my clothes and stitched everything. And so I grew up with lots of patterns and fabrics around the house and bits and bobs of scraps. And so I think that also informs the way that I put together these different layers in my compositions. That stitching that you see up there, like it's a very simple kind of stitching that you often see on the undergarments of children, actually, like it's called a chemise that you would wear under your dress. So they have associations for me that are like quite significant and deeper. But I also think that there's something about, in terms of this show and the way it's put together, the decision, for example, to mount these works on linen really speaks to the work being in some ways straddling a space between painting and drawing, but also being very much painting, in, which is very different from the Western gold standard of painting, which is oil on canvas, but painting as it exists across time and across the world is actually much more expansive. If you think about painting on silk, on board, the painting of thangkas, Tibetan thangkas on cloth, the miniature painting on Vasily paper, which is like a very hard, almost like a board-like paper. So also thinking about that kind of expanded materiality of painting as well.
I'm wondering, is the incorporation of so many different materials that would perhaps challenge traditional notions of the line between painting and textiles? Is this a very specific challenge, I guess, to art institutions and how we traditionally hang and keep things?
Um, I mean, I guess now that's being broken down a little bit more. There's a lot, I'm so happy to see um, there's a lot more of, I guess, an elevation of art forms that would have been considered that would have had a signification of being decorative or feminine, such as pottery and textiles. And so for me, I started to incorporate materials into my work in my large scale wall installations so that they were sculptural elements that kind of came off the wall, which was connected to this idea of depicting bodies that don't necessarily stay within their limits, that are kind of bursting out of their limits. And so for me, working across media, I get certain I employ certain formal strategies and then have certain ideas that then get transposed into other media as well.
Right. And I mean, I think that's what it opens up. So, Jana, you bring up a really good point in that institutions have certain ways of collecting and categorizing, but that's not necessarily how artists think about their work, right? So artists, they take their inspiration, they make what they make. And I think as people who work in institutions, they provide a really productive challenge to us to think outside the boxes of what we think as traditional categories of genre, of form, and things like that. But it's, oh, institutions are only catching up to what artists have paved the way in doing. And I think, I would love to touch, Chitra, a little bit about how the fact that, your practice comes out of your, sort of magpie love for so many different types of genres, of disciplines. So you studied in the storied semiotics program at Brown, and you have a sort of love for different forms of queer and feminist theory, of post-colonial theories, that, again, what I love about your work is it doesn't translate those things. It is those things, and I think that's the sort of brilliance of recognizing what role artists have in knowledge production, in producing a queer feminist ethos. It's not just about the texts that we read, but it's, how is that actually applied? And you've had such a wonderful kind of queer feminist practice that extends beyond just the studio, but it really is your deep involvement in a kind of queer feminist ethos that has informed your practice. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, what sources you think about.
Well, I think we had so before I came here, my partner Swan and I were walking down the street right around City Lights bookstore, and we came upon a table of research. I don't know if any of you remember this periodical zine from the 90s called Research. Anyway, that it so there's one of these issues that's called Angry Women, and it was very much it was concurrent to the like riot girl punk feminist moment, and so we were at the table admiring that all of the zines, and then we bought some of them that we don't have already, and the guy whipped out his phone and he was like, I was at your opening last night. I love your work because, we're actually culturally surrealists. And so it was really, really amazing. And so I feel like for me, that seeing and being seen by these, what is much harder in the kind of environment that we live in of even thinking, that's a whole separate conversation, but of what is a subculture in a moment where everything gets masticated into a product. But those kinds of like subcultural, feminist, queer science fiction iconography that I grew up with. I mean, who knew the 90s would look so amazing because they were so embarrassing at the time, but they really do. And so I really am happy to have had a lot of that exposure to things like that and those ways of thinking, as well as being part of multiple collaborative and collective art making processes, such as my collaborative work with Mariam Ghani called Index of the Disappeared, which looked at the implications of post 9/11 detention and deportation and how disappearance figured into that. Being part of the South Asian Women's Creative Collective and the queer South Asian community in the late 90s. So I think all of these, being in conversation with Black feminists and Black feminism, all of these very much inform my work.
I mean, that's just amazing because I think one way that, again, these different entry points function in your work, both visually, you know, thinking about the hole or the portal as a feminist gesture through which different routes can be taken, different forms of interpretation, different forms of imagination, seeing how your different sort of appreciations for different communities while also maintaining a position that subculture is something, it's a position of thinking. How do we always sort of privilege the minoritized, the overlooked, the, underspoken for or underappreciated, and use that as as our framework, as how do we always kind of use that as a strategy for imagining in these expansive ways. So I just love that, learning more about, how you came to be the kind of artist that you are. You are so gracious in again, the politics of citation, of the politics of the collective. And I think that really is evident in how your work is inviting, Yeah.
Well, I'm also wondering if it's the politics of citation is an inherently feminist gesture, because I think about surrealism and all these references that you do use, but you use them in a very destabilizing way. Is there almost a sense that these collaborations that you do, the citation is creating a new means of production that sort of challenges this traditional notion of the artist as like a historic or a heroic individual who exists without community?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's also trying to speak to our moment, which has so much focus on individuality, on icons, on individual influencers. I mean, this kind of um, thinking about the individual in relation to the environment as a larger um, in a larger holistic way is important in that way to my work, but also in terms of portals and in terms of these various citations, I think also moving towards multiplicity at a moment where things are extremely binary, all like politically, socially, in terms of how people are trying to regulate gender and women's bodies and a two-party system. I mean, there's so many ways that we see that. So something like a portal or something that can open that up to actually be capacious enough to hold, multiple, maybe infinite possibilities is important for me.
Right. And I think that this is something that's so important, I think, to understand about Chitra's work, which is that, yes, there is this science fictional, utopian, imaginative component, but all of that is informed by the politics of the present. I think that your work resists that sort of self-involved, almost narcissistic escapism because it actually challenges us to, well, if this is one possibility, how can we make that possibility real for everyone? I like that, these portals, these holes, these directions that you take us in always bring us back to, well, who are we together and what can we be together? And I think that's a real difference between this sort of shutting our eyes and ears off to the world and suffering and what's going on. I think that's a really lovely way of talking about, your work. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, I have to think of what time it is.
Yes.
Maybe open to questions?
Yeah.
So, could you maybe talk about what the politics of citation means for an art making practice? Because I think a lot of people are familiar with that in academic writing or in teaching. I think it means something much more exciting and expansive in art making. So, could you kind of give people an overview of that?
So one example of that in this work is, so a lot of the dense, rich foliage that you see here is imagined jungles, also made into jungles and forms like that that are also then made into textiles. So they take inspiration from a lot of these flora forms, take inspiration from the Bara Masa painting genre, which literally means 12 months, Bara Masa, and it's a it's usually a series of 12 paintings. It'll be in a series of 12, and it's about the seasonal cycle. And each painting is ascribed to a month. So, thinking about the climactic conditions, the rituals or the celebrations or the way of existing that happens within that period of time. And so, one of the things that I'm thinking about and citing here is that idea of a sort of expectation of a seasonal rhythm that I feel like has been really upended right now. So, for example, in New York City, which has been reclassified as a subtropical climate, we definitely had a summer of other people's monsoons that kept coming to our city. So that's like one form of one way in which a citation is operating here in the work. Another thing that's important for me right now about citing some of these painting practices is that they have historically and are inherently and historically have been very syncretic. So they have mixed, it is like Mughal painting, Rajput painting, Himalayan painting. So they draw from a variety of regions and I guess, you know, religions in a way in South Asia at a moment where India is trying to recodify itself as a Hindu nation. So that's also been really important for me, is to draw from practices that are syncretic and over hundreds of years rather, and that has been a way for me to expand my own iconography.
Right. And
So those are two examples
and
of how
what's
that works here.
so brilliant about that is that you are both, again, taking historical forms, celebrating them, but the very juxtaposition and eclectic combination of them actually displaces, them from just being in the past, and then it makes it, new portals, new ways of thinking about, things like Madhubani painting, things like, all these different sorts of forms. That, I think, was a dream that the surrealists had, that you could bring together something unfamiliar, juxtapose it, and then take it in a new direction. But the deep consideration you have of, which practices are endangered, which practices, what forms of syncretism are we forgetting in light of a, sort of fascist ideology creeping up. I think, so in a way, the politics of citation are not just about the specific individual citations that you're making, but also what is the gesture of recombination, of syncretism, allowing us to do in the face of, narrowing political sort of camps. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? Happy to hear from you. There's someone back there.
Hi, I'm Rishali. This is less of a question, but I'm trying to club in when you're speaking about the Baramasa, and I can't help but think about even the Patachitra, tradition, where even as you're looking at the historic tradition, being in the present is so important that even when located in such a small, regional spaces, the themes explored are absolutely global and relatable, So this is just something, I wanted to mention. Thanks.
Eyes, yeah. So I also think of, I mean, I think about the eyes in terms of vision and visuality. So, like, along the lines of the themes that we're talking about, like an expanded sense of vision. In some cases, like here, they're also kind of protective, as they would be with the evil eye. There's also the third eye, which signifies like supernatural perception or proprioception, like knowing where you are situated within space. So that's sort of how I think about the eyes in the work.
Hi. I actually wanted to ask about more about your process. I'm super interested to know, kind of like in your studio, like how you get moments of inspiration and how these amazing pieces sort of come together in your mind and on the page.
So sometimes I am inspired by, like, each piece has a different inspiration. So sometimes I'm inspired by the materials themselves. Like in the piece behind you, I really wanted to use grommets, which are, if for anybody who doesn't know, they're the things that you actually thread your laces through. Like I wanted that material to be in my work, and so this work was also about figuring that out, about how to like think with that material. In some cases, it's from a certain image or a composition that I am excited about. That painting of the woman there. So the foliage in that painting is actually the textile of the bed that I sleep on when I'm in Bangalore. It is our dear friend's bed. So at one point, actually at many points, like the point when I had COVID in India, some other point, I'm recovering. I find myself every other year or so recovering on this bed. And so spending a lot of time with that pattern was really important. And so that process of recovery, transformation, also how it becomes like a kind of a wallpaper, like a hallucinatory wallpaper. So that was sort of like the inspiration for that. So um, I think it depends, and it's really lovely to see the works all like cleaned up and organized in the gallery because my studio is a mess of sequins and broken glass and like bits of chalk and lots of fabric cuttings. Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, the image of your studio, I imagine there were plants in your studio, and I'm just wondering if you also collect plant specimens and things like that. In imagining these ecologies, which are so
So,
incredible, and
uh,
and the other thing I wanted to ask you is about color. When you use
okay, so the plants, actually, our home is like a jungle, a garden jungle, um, which is courtesy of Sva, my partner. But also, I do preserve flowers. When we were in Norway, I was preserving flowers. Like I often preserve the gulmohar flowers. They're called bougainvillea. Like they're bright fuchsia, pink, and red. And in each tree, there are like multiple colors within each branch. So those, but yes, I would say that the work is definitely informed by having a lot more plant life within my home, and then also having had a lot more time outside, both as we have more time to be outside in New York than we ever did. Like it stays warm now until November, actually, and then we live near a park. So all of that has definitely been part of how this work has developed. But yeah, you can come see our garden sometime, our inner apartment jungle. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the pigeon feels like a sort of very familiar, it's like a co-inhabitant of our city, and so it's part of this idea of we're actually all living here together, and so I was also thinking of it as something that's very familiar in terms of making the familiar strange or making the familiar wonderful. Like it is something that uh, it is an animal that I have spent a really long time looking at. And sometimes when we go away and then come back, the pigeons, initially when we come back, they're much closer at the window because we haven't been there for so long. So they've actually been used to sitting right there. So that experience is also part of that as well.
Right. Right. Oh.
I would love to have a cat. I would love to have a cat. I wish I had a cat. I'm a cat auntie. So we have a cat that we regularly babysit, and his name is Buddha.
No, I'm so happy to have had this opportunity to talk about your work. I mean, we could go on for a very long time.
And I'm happy to talk,
Yeah.
afterwards if you have other
Yeah.
questions. Feel free.
But, just as one kind of concluding thought, I just want to say that from working and thinking about your work for so long, for seeing the kind of work that you do, both in the studio and outside of it, the work that you do for other people, the support that you've given, you are just such a model of excellence for, not just the arts community, but beyond it. So congratulations, and thank you all so much for being here with us.
And you are also the people that I have been waiting for.